Hello, YouTube. This is Teach MA Dude, and I'm coming to you with what will probably be considered somewhat of a hot take. Today's video is about racism and what role does it play in schooling, and what can we do about that? Now, as a preface, this conversation is going to be one that's going to be challenging for a lot of people, and I think that is regardless of the racial kind of background that you identify with. As you can see here, take one good look at me. Okay, you can tell that I am a white person. And I'm going to start by saying, look, I recognize that throughout my life, I have certainly benefited from a significant amount of privilege due to the color of my skin. I'm not going to go into specifics about that, but I recognize that that is likely the case. And I also recognize that throughout history, we have had a complicated, situation with race in the United States going all the way back to the founding of our country and before that. And there are complex issues of race going on today. I'm fortunate as a teacher that I was able to engage in a lot of kind of cultural sensitivity training. And I do like to believe that I work hard on a daily basis to accept everyone into my classroom. Now, I do recognize, I do see color, I do see that people come from different backgrounds, but I also strive to do a couple things. One, to not let that impact how I view students, to view students based on, their interactions with each other, the work they bring to the table, and their interactions with me. But look, I also understand that as human beings, we have natural biases. And that goes for anyone, regardless of your background, regardless of what you look like, regardless of your gender, identity, or any of those kind of features. Everyone has biases. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I am immune from that. I probably have done things that are biased and even things that I don't realize are biased at the time. And my job is to constantly look within myself. And when I'm approaching a decision, or ideally before I've made a decision, but sometimes we make decisions and have to look back on it to try to examine whether what I am doing is based on a kind of bias. And that could be a cultural bias, that could be a bias towards someone for many reasons, right? No one is immune from that. So I think, though, it's important to ask ourselves, where does racism come into play? And I'm going to make a statement that is going to be a hot take. Not everything bad that happens to people of color is racist. It could be, but it is not necessarily so. And I think that, unfortunately, one thing we're seeing in our country, and I know that certain events over the past couple of years, um, that you two probably would not like me to say, have kind of exacerbated a lot of tension in America around race. I think it's important to consider that not everything is racist just because it happens to a black person or a brown person, etc. And similarly, we have to acknowledge that it is not only people of color who have some exclusive, monopoly on identifying what racism is. Anyone can see race, anyone can see racism. So, again, I think, if we look at schools, especially over the past few years, and as long as I've been teaching, it is true. Students of color have not performed as well as white people. And that's been a consistent thing in many, many districts, from Boston to the districts I worked in. And I think it's fair to ask ourselves, is there any kind of systemic structure involved? Perhaps it is the case that people of color don't have access to the resources, are not, and it's true, we know that in Boston, the net worth of a black family is significantly lower than the net worth of a white family. That has been proven time and time again. And given the complex racial history of Boston, given the extreme opposition to busing, And given the fact that many individuals in Boston are even bussed out to local communities thanks to the Metco program, I think it's safe to say that there is likely some systemic inequality that's playing into not giving everyone a fair chance. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, let's say that this is true, and I'm totally open to believing this is true. Now we get to the classroom. What is the expectation when we get to the classroom? And so I think a lot of the things that I've been seeing recently in the news and events all over the place is I understand that there's a lot of tension around race, but I think what's important is we have to take a moment. And again, look at my complexion. This is likely very easy for me to say, but I'm still saying I think we have to take a moment. I think we have to step back. And I think we have to ask ourselves, okay, what do we know about the scenario? Before we're going to jump to react, let's step back and let's look at the big picture and ask ourselves, why did this happen? Is there anything maybe that we're not seeing? And do we need to look into this further to gain a bit more insight? So, for example, I'll give you an example of something that happens in my school and in my classroom. Okay, so for example, maybe I will see some students walking down the hall. Those students might be students of color. I might see them acting very rowdy with one another, a word that we might say. And I'll stop and ask myself, okay, does this seem like something I would want to intervene with? And often I'll say, well, at the same time, if this was a group of white students, I might not perceive how they're interacting with each other as problematic. So if I wouldn't perceive white people that way, why would I want to perceive black people that way? Right? So that's a sense of me checking in on my own bias. Okay? So I think it's important that we're constantly checking in on these biases. In the classroom, what I will do, and this happened to me this year, I looked at a situation where I went back and looked at people's comments. And to me, it felt like comments of the student doesn't come to class with a good attitude. The student doesn't approach learning with a positive attitude. It seemed to me like this comment was being used more on students of color than white students, albeit I do not teach many students of color, but worth considering. So I stepped back and said, in the future, I'm going to rethink how I give comments to these students to make sure that I'm not giving, the same kinds of constructive comments to students of color. I'm thinking about other ways that maybe I can give comments that I also feel are given to other people, because I'm always open to examining my inner biases to see whether what I'm doing was potentially influenced by bias. And the reality is, with implicit biases, which are biases that we might not recognize, I understand that I'm not going to know necessarily in the moment if my action's coming from a place of bias. But I think it's important to understand that everyone has the bias. Now, again, if you're a person of color, it's likely that you have experienced racism in your life, and that's a privilege. I have not experienced racism in my life. I've experienced anti-Semitism, but I understand that's not necessarily the same thing as racism. And so I understand no one has commented on the color of my skin in a negative way, in my upbringing. But at the same time, we have to look in the now. Does the way you were treated by someone who was not me in the past justify being overtly or covertly racist to me, right? And I think that's an important question to ask, because look, the reality is, in schools and in life, racism is a problem. It's not good. It's not something that is good for our society. But at the same time, everyone from different backgrounds, white, black, brown, Asian, you name it, has to come together in unity to oppose racism. Given the events of the past few years, I do feel like there are more people who are white that are awakened to the reality that racism is a problem that needs to be fixed. And it always was that case, but I'm just saying it's become more on people's mind. However, I think at the same time, what I see as a concern is people that are very quick to write off an issue as racism, and then in turn to engage in a dialogue where anyone who is not Black is either racist when they disagree or and is not entitled to have any kind of say in the debate, to make a say on whether it's race or not based solely on the color of their skin. And in my opinion, that is racist as well. Everyone needs to have a place at the debate table, especially when you consider that this kind of conversation alienates people that would otherwise agree with you. In schools, we want students to look at the issues, to look at both sides, to take in all of the information rather than quickly rushing to judgment. And the reality is we have seen a lot of incidents that could be racist. In Cambridge in January, we saw a young man who I can tell you used to be one of my students who fatally met the end of his life at the hands of Cambridge police. Now, the police were going to say that they were, about to attack them and they had to do what they needed to do. They tried multiple different interventions and then had to resort to that kind of force. And, I think in that moment, given that the student was a student of color, Bangladeshi, it was important for me to say, okay, I understand what is being said, but we don't know all the facts. So I'm going to step back. I'm going to examine this objectively. I knew the student. The student did not seem like an individual who might be engaging in that kind of, very mentally kind of breakdown, added, behavior. But again, people do things that you don't expect them to do. Students in class might present you in a certain way that they act differently outside of class. So as more information came in, it started to inform my perspective. I learned that perhaps, again, the individual was in a state of mental breakdown, and it appears that the cops did not attempt to bring in someone with mental health expertise to talk them down. So that, again, is something that I would consider. And so, again, I would consider that, it seems that sometimes in communities of color, there isn't enough mental health support and there isn't enough effort sometimes to, before resorting to harmful force, to really bring in people with expertise. And this has impacted people of all races. But unfortunately, it seems that in communities of color, there happens to be less resources. So for me, I step back and say, okay, could there have been a racial element involved? Yeah, likely in that, there was not resources that were allocated to this individual who needed them. That to me is an example of systemic racism, to the extent that certain groups of color don't systematically or systemically have the resources they need to access the supports that prevent them from reaching those crucial junctures where they unfortunately meet the end of their life. In addition, when I think about the response, why was the response from my school treated like they would treat anyone else's response? Unfortunately, many students in a larger school pass away over the years, and to kind of brush it under the rug and just act like it was someone else passing away, that's concerning. But at the same time, I think it was important that I step back and, before saying racist, 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 that I took a moment to really look at all the facts and to understand the nuances of everyone. Because the reality is, in many of these racial incidents, none of us who are putting in our cents were there for it. None of us witnessed it. None of us know the precise truth. And unfortunately, one thing that we've seen, and many of us have seen as teachers, is that the cameras often don't come on until it's at a time that benefits the holder of the camera. Now, in the event of that young man from Minneapolis who met his end of his life due to his neck being kneeled on, it was very fortunate. That was very good documentary filmmaking in that the camera was out the whole time, right? It was out everywhere it needed to be. Everything was filmed that needed to be filmed. But I've also seen instances where individuals engage in, misconduct. Sometimes we'll see videos of students who will really rile the teacher up, who will really engage in very inappropriate behavior. And it is only after doing so that the camera comes out. And then at that point, based on the race of the individuals, sometimes they will then claim that the teacher is being racist. And I'm not saying that this happens all the time, but it also doesn't happen none of the time. So I think that as educators and as a community, we need to be cautious in the way we act. We need to be deliberate in the way we act. We need to examine ourselves for biases as much as possible. And I think it's good, as I did, to seek out resources, to seek out professional development for engaging in those difficult conversations with students, with peers, and with parents as appropriate. But I also think it's important when we engage in our practice deliberately to say to ourselves, honestly, I've had time to reflect. I've had time to look back, and what I did was fair. I created a classroom where I held everyone to expectations of respect. I held them to expectations of coming on time. I held them to the expectation of you're expected to complete your work thoroughly. And that's not a race-based expectation. Respect is universal in cultures across the world. Coming on time is an appropriate expectation for students who you want to be successful now and as adults. And again, is expected in cultures across the world. And completing your work, well, how do you learn if you don't complete your work? And then within enforcing those expectations, you make sure that you're enforcing them in a way that's equitable and even. If you have a student who maybe has to work outside of school, are you talking with that student? Are you working with that student to find ways they can complete the work? I've talked about the triangle of responsibility and how, unfortunately, I believe that that's the parent's responsibility, and that is actually likely a reflection on the parent that that student has what I consider to be inappropriate, responsibilities. Students not responsible for providing income to the house. That should never be the student's responsibility. But the reality is that when the rubber hits the road, sometimes it happens, right? When the student's being punctual, if they're not being punctual, are you addressing all students that way? If a student of color comes in, are you addressing them the same way you address a white student, right? If the student comes in late, if you assign them a detention for being late, even if the bell's rung and they're right around the corner, are you doing the same thing for a Black student, brown student, Asian student? Are you treating them all the same as the white student? And if the answer is yes, then respectfully, I think that the expectations you're holding are good ones. And I think that you cannot sit back or you should not sit back and feel that you are being racist as a teacher for holding students to high expectations and then calling them on it, again, as long as you're doing it in a fair and equitable way. I think a lot of these concerns around equity, where we think about how are we punishing students? How are we disciplining students? How are we expecting them to do homework? What these attempt to do is they attempt to even the playing field for everyone, which I think is important. Everyone should have the same level of access. But the question is, at what cost? Because as we know, and as I would posit, if you have students who are not getting the support within the school, students will get that support at home. You will create inequities because outside of the school environment, everything is inherently inequitable. Life is not equitable. That's a reality. School cannot fix the community. That is not the school's responsibility. The school is there to educate students in spite of or despite the situations going on in the community. And unfortunately, that is an issue that many school reformers fail to take into account. We see issues of, you know, schools being taken over. In one of my previous videos, I talked about how BPS was being taken over potentially, but then, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education decided to back off of that. And many people thought that was racist because, one, Boston is a majority minority district. And two, because it seemed that, Marty Walsh, the former mayor, was being given time and time again to reform the schools to no avail. But Michelle Wu, who had just shown up, was not being given those opportunities. So time will tell whether the decision not to take over BPS was a smart decision. I can tell you from my own research that Boston Public Schools has a lot of problems. They disproportionately represent the findings that they've broken the law compared to other districts in the state. And they have a deep-seated issues with educating students. We could argue that that's racism, but the reality is there's a lot of poverty in that community. There's a lot of violence in that community. There are a lot of broken homes in that community. No takeover will fix any of that. The takeover only benefits the schools. So, in summation, right, closing it out, racism is a problem in America. It has been a problem since America's founding, and it is not over. Those of you who deny systemic racism are kidding yourselves. Systemic racism is a thing, and students are starting at unequal places, though it's starting to get more equal, but it's not there yet. Students are not starting at the same place because of, frankly, how they look and the background they come from, because we're still working to equalize that out. But at the same time, within the school environment, if we are creating systems where everyone is being treated in an equitable way, and I'm not saying treating them equally, I'm saying giving them all the same opportunity, then we have to accept the reality that not everything that happens to a person of color is racist. I think it's fair to step back. I think it's fair to examine whether we could have been biased. And I think it's fair to have these conversations with our colleagues and constantly reflect on our actions and come to a sense of, is what I did appropriate? However, I do not think that teachers, especially white teachers, who are likely the ones who are disproportionately made to feel like their actions are racist, should have to constantly rack their minds thinking that they're some kind of evil racist individual, as long as they've reflected deeply on their practices. Their practices are equitable to people of all races, backgrounds, and linguistic diversities. And they are giving the kids a high quality education. Because the reality is, as long as teachers have to feel racist, what is going to ideally happen, or I guess unideally happen, is that they're going to lower the bar for everyone in an attempt to make things equitable, when in reality, lowering the bar simply will lead to everyone's quality of performance, of work, of behavior declining. And I can tell you from experience in the college environment, what that's going to do is lead to college kids who are uniquely unprepared for the realities of college and are not ready to take on the responsibilities of adulthood, where, life is not fair. All right, so this has been another episode of Teach MA Dude. Thank you so much for watching, YouTube. I greatly appreciate it. Please feel free to leave a comment. Keep this conversation going. I'd love to talk further with you about this. And, feel free to like and subscribe. hit that notification bell so you can keep listening to all I've got to say about teaching in Massachusetts. And you have yourselves a wonderful day.